Greetings all, welcome back to another session here of TESOL methods and materials. Today we're going to be looking at teaching listening and teaching speaking. In the next video we'll do the other half of teaching reading and writing. We will do a little investigation of the research on these four skills, and we'll also talk about some of the micro and macro components that can be taught in each of these areas. Let's jump right into listening. Teaching listening, we'll look at some research issues, some listening difficulties, again, the macro and micro functions, and some principles for teaching, as well as how we assess the teaching of listening. Now, let me begin by this question down here. What do listeners do when they, in fact, listen? What is this thing that they're doing? The sound goes into their ear, okay? And after the sound goes into their ear, of course, those sounds have to be converted into messages that go into the brain, and the person hears these sounds, and then they have to combine all these sounds into some meaningful message. They begin to hear words, and as they take the words, they have to create the message that was created. The person at the other end, of course, they're speaking the words. They've already have the idea in their head. They convert it to sound and send it to the ear. And once it arrives here, of course, they now have to put it together. So there's a lot of things going on in the process of listening. There are the mechanical things just to get the sound into the brain properly. But then after these sounds get there, the person has to piece together that message so that they can understand it. You see, there are a lot of things going on, a lot of places where interference can be. So, for example, just hearing the sounds would be considered input. Okay, you go to Nepal and you listen to Nepali speak, you're going to get input. Doesn't make much sense, though, because it's not comprehensible input. It's not input that you can understand, okay? That would be considered intake, right? That's stuff that you can actually put into your memory that you can actually understand, not that you will actually be able to remember it. But there's a step here. There's input, and then there's intake, and then there's uptake, and that's stuff that you can actually appropriate. So there's a lot of things going on and a lot of things that can get in the way. Another way of looking at listening is that there are two different types of listening. There's active listening, which I hope you're doing right now, that you're listening and you're following along and you're paying attention and you're giving assent to, or you're disagreeing, or you're actively involved in the listening process. You may be taking notes so that you can follow along. And then there's passive listening. Passive listening is what you do when you're not really paying attention specifically to what's going on, but you just kind of hear it in the background. You're not having an active role in listening. You're resting, as it were. You're listening, but you're not totally listening. So difference between the two there. We obviously want to see more students do active listening because it requires more interaction, and more interaction means more learning. Okay, what factors affect learning? What do we listen for? There are a number of things that we do listen for. What are the factors that affect learning? So many things that can affect our learning. Our affective filter, I guess, would be a large one. Whether we're frustrated or not frustrated, happy or sad, whether we're tired or not, whether we have a hearing problem or not. Fear, right? Could be a lot of things that can affect listening. Obviously, we want to take that into consideration when we go to teach listening. There are also sometimes some difficulties involved with listening. There's planned and unplanned listening. That's what I find interesting. Right now, you're planning to listen, right? It's not a difficult thing to do here, but there are times where things just pop up and you're not ready, and you're kind of unprepared for the listening. Or perhaps you're sitting in a restaurant and all of a sudden you begin to hear and then listen to the people behind you or the people next to you, and that's unplanned. You're not ready for this, okay? Different types of listening involved in those two. One is planned. You're ready to do it. Other types of listening are single person listening, or you're listening to one person, or you're listening to multiple people, right? It's in dialogue or it's in monologue. So it's another style of listening. Again, single listening would be a lot easier. When you've got multiple people going, it's going to become more difficult. Other difficulties that some listeners might have would be the idea of clustering. And clustering, of course, is having groups of words all put together to form some meaningful unit, like a prepositional phrase or a noun clause. Those could be considered clusters of words. It could be clusters of sounds as well, having trouble hearing a particular sound cluster. But in any event, students may have difficulty with clustering because they haven't learned to deal with that yet. They may be difficulty with the ideas of redundancy, hearing or using the same or similar words over again in a sentence, and what that means. They will definitely have problems with reduced forms. I, in fact, remember teaching speaking. I taught a whole bunch of reduced forms that students were telling me they didn't know what that meant. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Right? What are you doing? And we're like, what? What is that? What are you doing? Oh, right. And you had to show them the reduced forms. Then there are just regular reduced forms in spoken and in written form. And if you're reading the written form or if you're speaking the written form, those reduced forms, again, can cause problems. Fillers, like ums and ahs or let me see, or and what they mean. By the way, those are actual vocabulary words, and those words do exist in other languages. I still have to laugh at students that I know from Japan when they're trying to fill in a word, like I do. My favorite word here is or ah. For them, it would be eto. Eto, and then they would continue talking in English. Well, eto is a Japanese word, just like our fillers are. Anyway, students may have difficulty, listening difficulties with those. And then colloquials, words that aren't typically in a dictionary and a standard dictionary, words that are well, they're not standard. And they're words that students may not be able to, may not have learned when they were studying, and so it's going to be more difficult for them to pick those up and, of course, understand what they are. In truth, they're not going to have a listening difficulty there. My opinion is that they will actually hear the word, they'll hear it clearly, but they have no idea what it means because it's a colloquialism. Younger students may have difficulty with rate, or the speed in which words are spoken. And again, I've talked about that before, whether you talk at normal speed or slow down for the younger learners, or whether you leave it at normal speed and get them to learn to deal with that speed. That's up to you. Stress is going to be a problem for some students. They're not going to be able to understand what's going on because of the stress difference. Rhythm and intonation. Those all may be things that students may run into as problems as they're trying to learn listening. Obviously, those are things that you can be teaching. As far as areas and functions that you can be focusing on when you're trying to teach listening is, for younger learners in particular, you can deal with the micro elements, the small segments, the reduced forms, the word boundaries, where a word begins and ends, sound creation, right? Blends, diphthongs, that kind of thing. Function words, those are things like prepositional phrases, and so you can work on the micro elements so that students can begin to hear the difference between where a word begins and ends, and that kind of thing. You can also move up to larger elements, cohesive devices, those connecting words, communicative functions, asking for permission and whatnot, inferring, detecting key words, distinguishing literal and implied, just listening for the main idea, listening for the gist, listening for specific information. So there are a lot of things that you as a teacher can focus on. Obviously, the first thing you're going to want to do if you're going to be teaching is to find out what they know, what they don't know. Where is their listening level so that you can create materials appropriate to them. Again, the more micro-level elements are going to be for beginning students, generally speaking, and then the larger ones are going to be for more advanced students. There are times where more advanced students want to improve their pronunciation greatly, and then you have to delve back into the minor things so that they can hear those pronunciation differences. Principles for teaching listening. Focus on listening with other skills. Again, you're trying to do an integrated approach. There have been numerous times where I have a great teachable moment. Someone says, they want the pon, and so we stop right there and we do a minimal pairs type of activity where they have to listen for the difference between pon and phone, right? Pace and face. Maybe I'd do that as an example, and then they would have to try to hear that minimal pair. But I'm doing this right in the middle of some other activity. We stop and we focus on listening, and then we go back. So Try to find stuff that's intrinsically motivating, stuff that they're interested in. Try to use authentic language if you can. Go out and find real information. There's tons of stuff out there. Check for listening comprehension. Those are things that you're going to want to do almost always. You're going to be checking to make sure they understand what's being said. And there are ways that you can test for that. Not easy necessarily. There are times where people are like, you understand? And they're like, oh, yes, yes, yes. Then they go on and they don't understand. So make sure they understand. Encourage the development of new listening strategies, ways that they can try to distinguish between sounds or words, or ways that they can try to figure out what a word is. Encourage listening strategies. I had a student once, while I was speaking, they looked at me like I was, what the heck was that? And I was just saying, first of all, we are going to be studying thus and so. And he's like, first of all. He looked up the word in the dictionary. That was his strategy. And the word that he looked up was festival. He just could not understand. Later on, he asked another student, and they said, no, it's not festival, it's first of all. Very fun story. Anyway, try to get them to have listening strategies. Use both top-up and bottom-down processing. In other words, try to get them to step back and try to hear the whole thing and try to figure out what the gist is. And also get them to move down and look at the little pieces. See if they can understand those little pieces as well. How do you assess listening? There are a number of ways to do it. This is one of the harder areas to test. Simply because you have to take the word of the student. You have to take the word of the student in what they're understanding or not understanding, right? Assessment is not only a standard test. There's intensive listening. Listening for sound discriminations, listening for patterns. Those are things where they can actually write things down. Responsive listening. The student has to respond to thus and so, right? And so they're listening, and as they're listening, they're told they have to go do or say or do, or complete something, okay? That's responsive listening. Selective listening. Listen for the gist. Listen for specific data. Right? And then extended listening, where you have a long dictation, or you have a lecture and they have to take notes, or you have a dictation and they need to literally write down the dictation. Lots of different ways that you can do and work with listening. Listening is fun, especially at the upper level, my opinion. At the lower level, you're merely trying to get them to distinguish sounds and word endings, and then begin to grapple with some of the more unique sounds that they may be running into that they don't know. Let's move on to teaching speaking. Teaching speaking does have some interesting components to it as well. Again, the question down here, what do speakers do when they speak? Okay, what is the process that's going on in their head? They begin again with an idea in their head, and they need to translate that idea into words, and it gets sent out through their mouth and all the muscles that are involved there. But speaking, again, is a complex process, and there are a number of elements that are moving and going on while it's being done, right? So we can look at conversational discourse and how conversations emerge as far as turn-taking and interrupting and negotiating. And there's been research on ways that this is done, ways that it's done in different cultures. And that's an area that has been done in research, but it's also an area that you can pull into when you're speaking, teaching speaking, showing students how to politely interrupt, how to take turns when you're speaking, how to negotiate meaning, right? Also be teaching pronunciation. How should we teach adults? Teaching pronunciation is more difficult with adults because all their little proteins are missing. Well, not all of them, but many of them. When you're a little tot, you're preteen, you've got hundreds of extra proteins that are developing the brain so that sounds can be made properly and be heard properly, which is why often when little guys learn a second language, they are better at pronunciation because they have all those extra proteins. You're dealing with an adult who doesn't have those proteins. Learning the pronunciation of a language is going to be more difficult. Again, because they're missing the proteins that would normally help them develop their brains to hear and pronounce properly. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be done. Only that it's going to be more difficult. I typically want to work with sounds that are easy to see. In other words, you can see them on your mouth. Or they're easy to hear. There are some sounds that are hard to see. The L and the R, very difficult. It's often very difficult for many people. But I'll try to deal with things that are either impeding meaning or are visible to the eye when you look at somebody's face. So the F sound, for example, the P sound, I'm going to probably teach because I can see them. If there's a sound that students are making that it's bad for meaning, bad for somebody else to understand, I'll probably work on that as well. So we're going to teach them differently than we teach kids. Because with adults, we can, first of all, we have analytic capabilities, and we also have the ability to study and focus on a discrete sound, something that they're working on, right? What do we do with the whole deal of fluency and accuracy? You're always going to have this battle for adults, primarily because they can do better with accuracy, at least linguistically, not phonetically. I would want it, especially students that have more accuracy. I would want to deal more with fluency. Which is more important? Answer: both are more important. I would not stand on either side. It will depend on the amount of accuracy they have, the amount of fluency that they have. Some students are going to have great accuracy, and so then you want to focus more on fluency. Some people aren't in the public eye. They're not speaking a whole deal, so I'm going to work less on their fluency. Maybe they're writers. They're using their language to do more writing than speaking. I'll work less on fluency then. For people who are going to be teachers in another country and they need to be able to speak properly, maybe I would emphasize more on the fluency. You want to have balance there. And when do you teach? I would consider teaching these to be if students already know the language. In other words, they're beyond beginners. And they already have language under their belt. I'd begin working with accuracy, probably more than fluency. Again, fluency, is it damaging meaning? Is it damaging? Is it easy to see? Then I would work on those. If I'm working with beginning level adults, I'll start right away because they don't have to relearn anything. I'll just start right away with what they're learning with these new words. Adults have different affective issues than younger kids. They have more pride, they have more fear, they have more fear of being ridiculed, and so they tend to have a higher affective filter when it comes to speaking. Got to find some way to deflate that so that they feel at ease speaking and making mistakes and having fun when they're learning language. There's also interaction issues. Again, it's the same type of thing. Some adults are more leery of reaching out and being active in a new language and being silly and willing to make mistakes. They're also less interested in running around and playing games and playing Simon Says, and not that it can't be done, mind you, but there are different issues for adults than with kids. So we want to be careful of the issues of affect and interaction, depending on age. When they're littler, there are fewer affective issues. Again, make it fun for the kids, and they'll practice speaking all day. There are some other issues: dialect register and digital samples. There are so many different dialects in the English language. Which one do you teach? Which register do you teach? I have come to believe that as a teacher of standard English, I should teach the dialect, the registers that I know. Don't try to go and teach others that I don't know. So I'm not going to teach British dialects. I'm not going to teach registers from which I am unfamiliar. But I will want to teach different registers, speaking to someone who is higher up in society versus somebody who is lower down in society. Also learning how to treat people with respect. Okay. What factors affect speaking? I believe we've talked about a lot of them. Obviously, there are physical elements that affect it. There are cultural elements that affect speaking. And so there are a number of factors that can impact the way people speak. A lot of them are affective. Some of them are cultural. Let's move on. Speaking difficulties. We've talked about some of these before. We still have planned speaking. We have unplanned speaking. More people are probably afraid of the unplanned speaking. You got to get up and give a speech type of thing. There's personal dialogue. There's personal speaking, private or public speaking. There's imitative speaking. There's interactional speaking, right? You're interacting with somebody. Transactional, where you're actually transferring information. Intensive, extensive type of speaking opportunities. There are many different ways that we speak, and these can also be problems when you're not prepared for them. There are going to be clustering issues, again, redundancy issues, reduced form issues, fillers, as I already mentioned in my last little segment here. They're going to have problems with colloquials, rate, stress, rhythm, intonation. Funny, with the older speakers, things like stress, rhythm, and intonation are things they're going to have much more difficulty with because they can't hear them. Not all of them, but some of them. They can't hear the differences, and so they can't reproduce them. Quite interesting. You may have some interaction issues with students as well. Macro functions here. Again, with speaking, you can focus on small segments like pronunciation, reduced forms, right? Like, what are you doing? Hiya, how are ya? Right? What's up? Or as my daughter would say, what's up? What's up? A reduced form. You can talk about word boundaries and how they blur. You can focus on function words, and speaking with function words. Again, macro level, you can do cohesive devices. You can do communicative functions, inferring, detecting keywords, distinguishing literal implied meanings in spoken words. Let's move on. Principles for teaching speaking. Focus on fluency and accuracy. Try to get a balance. Again, if they're brand new, definitely do that. If they're older and they already have some language under them, I'd work less with fluency. Again, balance, not balance. Again, is it hurting meaning, and is it easy to fix? Okay, if it's easy to fix and it's not hurting meaning, if it's easy to fix and it's hurting meaning, then you might want to focus more on that. Intrinsically motivating speech. Find stuff that they're interested in talking about. Encourage authentic language use. Check speaking. Offer constructive feedback. And we're going to talk about feedback later on, ways of getting people to change their speaking. And oftentimes I just do this with a question. I eated lunch. I said, you what? And I'll make them say it again, make them rethink about what they said. Oh, you ate lunch? Yeah, I ate lunch. That would be it. Another thing I could do is give them the correction in a response. Encourage authentic language use, as I've already said. Check for speaking feedback. Monitor and attune, both positives and negatives. Keep motivation high. So you want to keep an eye on what they're saying, no pun intended, and you want to be able to give feedback. Make sure that you're continually encouraging them as you give them feedback. You as a teacher, you're there to help them pronounce better. Keep it trippingly on the tongue. I want them to pronounce better so that they can be better speakers. That means that you need to be giving criticism, but at the same time, keep motivation high. Provide opportunities for speaking. If at all possible, get your students to go out of class and do interviews or discussions outside of class so that they can continue to practice. If you have limited number of people to do that, you may want to try something like Skype, or find people who are on your campus or at your school that they could speak at. Other factors. Other factors. One would be pronunciation. We've already spoken about pronunciation with age. Younger they are, the better off they're going to be because of those proteins. There's also going to be L1 influence. If a language doesn't have a particular sound, as I mentioned before, the Korean language doesn't use the F sound, so if they, instead of saying phone, they say pone many times because they're missing that sound. That's a crossover from their language. It's going to impact language speaking. Exposure is going to be another one. The more exposure one has to the target language, the more likely they're going to be pronouncing it better. And then lastly, identity. Some people are going to be speaking less because that's what they do in their culture, that's what they do in their language, and so they feel less at ease, possibly at getting interaction. Motivation will be another one. People just simply aren't interested in getting involved for any number of reasons. Your job as a teacher is to encourage them, get one of the two seats that they have to encourage them, the carrot or the stick. And then innate ability. Some people are just better at speaking. Some people like speaking, so they do it more. Some pronunciation factors. Encourage the development of speaking strategies, as I mentioned before with regard to listening strategies. Have students try to speak as often as possible, both in class and out of class, and learn those strategies so that they can get to be better speakers by stealing practice from other people. Types of assessing. Imitative speaking, right? Minimal pairs. You all know what a minimal pair is, right? Feet and street, for example. The only difference is the st and the f. Ear and year. Ear and year is a minimal pair, right? You have students listen to the two and try to be able to pronounce both of them or identify which ones they are, right? Sentence repetitions. One conference I was at, someone had done a whole research project on something called shadowing. The teacher will say something, and then right afterwards, the student will say something. The teacher just keeps talking, and the students just keep following. And so you just have this constantly spoken repetition throughout the whole class. And they would do it for the entire class. By the time they were done, students were exhausted because they were speaking for so much. But a lot of practice, a lot of interaction. Intensive speaking, for example, doing read-alouds, doing dialogue completions, readers theater, acting, that kind of thing you can do as well. There's responsive speaking, question and answer type of things, games, there's interaction that's going on. Interactive speaking for games, for interviews, for acting. Extensive speaking, things like speeches and lectures, where you can have them practice. Score things with a rubric so that you can provide opportunities to show them not only a general score for speaking, but you can show them their pronunciation, their diction, their how loud they were, right? How expressive they were. And so there's a variety of things that you can look at to help them improve their overall speaking abilities. And that's all I'm going to do for now. Next time we're going to jump into the reading and the writing aspects of teaching the 4 skills. If you do have any questions, again, please contact me. I'll be glad.